So you're wearing an Aloha shirt?
Yeah, it's a little bit warm here in Switzerland, but as we were discussing, it's also a little bit of a remembrance of our friends in Hawaii.
Yeah, because you lived there for some time, right?
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so I want to have you on because recently the Chinese Coast Guard performed a unsafe maneuver and fired water cannons on a Filipino ship in the South China Sea, specifically near the Second Thomas Shoal, which is another one of those locations China has a territorial dispute with the Philippines. Well, first, can you give us a little situation about what the situation is there? What's going on? Like, why is the Second Thomas Shoal important, and why the Philippines have a boat run aground there?
Yeah, so the Second Thomas Shoal is in the South China Sea, the southern part of the South China Sea, in the Spratly Island archipelago. It's within 130 miles of Palawan, which is one of the major islands of the Philippines. So it's well within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. You know, in 1995, the PRC basically took over an outpost that had been Filipino at Mischief Reef and just took it over. And so the tensions in the South China Sea have been going on since, since the Chinese Communist Party came to power. Not really. I mean, they weren't focused on it in 1949, but after the Vietnam War and the Americans, kind of their presence there was not like it was during the war. The Chinese started to slowly assert themselves in the South China Sea. They didn't have a lot of naval power, so it was a slow go, but they did some things. In 95, they took Mischief Reef, which is less than about 30 miles, just about 30 miles from Second Thomas Shoal. And they took it over, and here in the last decade, they built it into a major naval air station. Well, anyway, in 95, when that happened, the Filipinos started to be concerned that the Chinese were going to just keep, like dominoes, the next place would be Second Thomas Shoal. And the Filipinos said, we can't let that happen. We've already lost Mischief Reef. Well, what are we going to do? And they couldn't do much. They had a very small Navy, basically a Navy that had been given to them by the United States with a lot of old ships from World War II. So they took one of those, which is called an LST, an amphibious landing ship, and they ran it aground at Second Thomas Shoal, and they just drove this ship right on to the onto the shoal, and that was 1999 when they did that, and they've been there ever since, and they've kept a small contingent of sailors. I think it's somewhere around 8 to 10 sailors that are on board the LST. It's got a new name now. It's called the Philippine Navy ship Sierra Madre. So the Sierra Madre has been basically a home to the Philippine Navy so that they can basically provide a physical presence to show that the Philippine government intends that to be part of their sovereign territory. And that's one of the ways you can do it in international law, is to show that you've kept possession of something and that you intend to keep it. And so the Filipinos have kept it all that long, and the Chinese periodically have tried to harass and disrupt things. And so if you go back to like 2014, when I was still in uniform, the Chinese did a similar event where they sent some Coast Guard vessels there to stop the Philippine Navy from what they had been doing for, at that point, 15 years, resupplying those sailors, every 2 or 3 months, bringing them water and food, letters from home, whatever it is to keep them on the ship. It's really austere conditions. It's in the middle of the South China Sea. It's quite hot. It's humid. You're on a rust bucket from, no disparaging remarks of the Philippine Navy, but it is a rusted out amphibious warship from World War II. So there was a documentary expose done in the New York Times about it, and the name is escaping me. I think it's like Sharks and Minnows, and it shows really the New York Times reporter got on board the ship. So if people are interested, they can watch that and actually see the condition of the ship as it was almost 10 years ago when they wrote that article. And so that's exactly kind of what's been happening, is that it's just been a slow simmer there, and the Filipinos are just, they're pretty stubborn, and I don't blame them. That's their territory, and the only way they can keep it is to just keep those sailors down there and just kind of a status quo. And the Chinese in 2014 tried to disrupt it, and many times since then, they try to disrupt these operations. In 2014, when they did it, the Filipinos had normally resupplied the outpost with other Philippine Navy ships. And in that case, they started to have to use bunker boats, these small fishing craft that the Filipinos have without riggers on them. And they had to kind of basically sneak out there in the middle of the night and kind of send two or three in different directions to confuse the Chinese to let one of these slip in to bring the food and water. And that's kind of been going on and off, and then slowly the Philippine Navy was able to resume its resupply operations until this latest incident on the 5th of August, when the Chinese Coast Guard once again stepped in and prevented the Philippine Navy tried to prevent the Philippine Navy, to try to block them from resupplying the ship. And they used water cannon and they used ramming techniques to push away the much smaller Filipino vessels that were using to resupply. In this case, they were Philippine Coast Guard. And the Chinese Coast Guard vessels are quite large, some of them the size of U.S. Navy destroyers, 10,000 tons. The Chinese have told us that some of those have had reinforced hulls that they admitted were designed to ram other ships, which is not the purpose or intent of having a Coast Guard. So it's just kind of one of these things that's gone up and down, and now it's just flared up again. So the question is, why is it flared up? And there's a whole lot of speculation about that. Part of it, I think, is to do with the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is on the timeline, on this timeline of this great rejuvenation that Xi talks about, of the China dream. And they want to make sure that they have undeniable sovereign control over what they think is their territory. And they think that the 9-dash line, or this large portion of the South China Sea, is their territory.
Are you saying that they're actually going to try to take over the Second Thomas Shoal, or are they just asserting power by trying to block the resupply?
Well, I think in this case, they tried to assert their power by blocking the resupply. And then post-event, we've had two requests from the Philippine, or the Chinese ambassador to the Philippines, demanding that the Filipino government haul off the Sierra Madre off the shoal, which is not going to happen because it's in such a fragile state of repair that if you started to try to pull it off, it would become an ecological disaster in that area. So that's not going to happen. Plus, I think there's reports out there and rumors that the Philippines, over the years, have also, in addition to bringing out in food and water, they've brought out steel and some concrete, and they've tried to do what they can to shore this thing up as best they can in those austere conditions. So I think what's happened is that the Filipinos are just trying to hold tight and waiting for this to see how the Americans react. They have a new president, but the Chinese seem to be intent that at some point they're just going to keep. It's like I think I used this the last time we talked. It's if you take a spoon, a metal spoon, and you just bend it back and forth, there's a weak spot there, and they're trying to create a weak spot where the Filipinos crack and break.
So if the Chinese Communist Party successfully gets that Second Thomas Shoal, since China's already controlling one of these shoals, or now artificial islands, that's near the Philippines, if they get this other one, what is the value to them, and what is the loss to the Philippines?
Well, I think it's, in terms of military power, it's not really any value to China relatively, given the fact that they got 7 military installations already within spitting distance of Second Thomas Shoal. So they don't really gain much. They have Mischief Reef, they have Subi Reef, they have Fiery Cross Reef, very close by, all have 10,000-foot runways, major naval pier spaces that can bring in any kind of ship in the PLA Navy inventory. The airfields can take bombers all the way down to fighters and drones. So they're set down there from a military perspective. But what it does to the Philippines is it further embarrasses them. So when Shelley asked me what was kind of the reason for this, or what was the PRC's agenda, I kind of answered a tactical question. But at a strategic level, it's very clear to me, at least, that because there's been a change in administration in the Philippines from President Rodrigo Duterte to President Marcos, that President Marcos has now kind of resumed the more classic Philippine approach to their national security interest in the South China Sea, or what they call the West Philippine Sea. And they don't want to give up their sovereignty to the PRC, where President Duterte was a little bit more seemingly willing to negotiate with the Chinese and talk to the Chinese and and was very openly critical of the United States. Since Marcos has come in, he's added 4 bases, not 5, 4 bases to the existing Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement that was signed in 2014 between the U.S. and China, that allowed the United States to have kind of a resumption of access to Philippine military installations after we left in 1991, after the Philippine Senate, by a vote of one person, one senator, voted for the United States to be basically physically removed out of the Philippines, the military, U.S. military. And so we left in 91, and for the next 23 years, the U.S. didn't have military installations or access to the Philippines. But in the early tens, the negotiations between the U.S. government and the Philippine government said, "Hey, we would like to have access to these, what they call rotational access to facilities." So it was places, not bases, was the buzz phrase, so that we wouldn't permanently be there as a military force, but we would rotate in and out through there. That would allow us to have reconnaissance aircraft like the P-8 or a port call of a ship or something like that. So that's kind of been going on. And then under Duterte, it kind of, I didn't say it didn't reverse, it just didn't accelerate much. But then when Marcos came in, he said, "Hey, we need to do some more here, and we're willing to give you access to some other bases." Now, 3 of them were up in northern Luzon. People speculate that has has some involvement with any plans that the United States would have in case of a PRC invasion of Taiwan. But one of the 4 was down in Palawan. So it was clearly, there was a reference to an importance that the Philippines and the United States places on increasing U.S. and Philippine cooperation in the South China Sea.